Many years later, the soft breeze whirled around Masai as he held his beloved close. 1,000,000 twinkling stars glimmered overhead, and even though they were completely and utterly bewildering, they paled when compared to the cleric's eyes. She smiled at him with that haunting grin, and her delicate fingers grazed his cheek. Tickles danced up his skin, and his soul burned hotter than a desert day. Together, they twirled about to faint music. Her body pressed up against his, and her hot breath blasted on his neck. In the distance, sand dunes surrounded them, but the area they danced in had been cleared out and made flat with rocky mud-brown tiles. A sense of urgency flared within him, and Masai moved in to place a kiss on her forehead. The cleric's smile grew wider in anticipation, and she closed her eyes. Masai did the same. When once they met, he had been a child. But now, Masai was a man. Any second now, his lips would grace her soft skin. Something thudded into him, and his mind blackened with savage abruptness. Slight pain danced up his nerves, and he sat up in bed. At first he opened his eyes wide, but then he squeezed them shut. The brightness from the morning sun had blasted into his bedroom window. Soft giggles found their way into his ears, and a sudden groan trickled up his throat. The laughter had a feminine quality about it, so it automatically ruled out his two older brothers, Joti and Nicholls. Masai blinked several times as his eyes adjusted to the brightness of the room. Much as he had expected, Eaina sat beside him on the bed. A devilish smile creased her face, and her deep brown eyes shimmered with the same sense of vibrance that their mother once had. She wore her favorite white dress. How she managed to keep it clean and dirt-free was beyond him, but she certainly maintained her garment's color. Eaina's hair had been braided into a large bun on the back of her head. Masai rubbed his eyes again.
What in the name of Dia is your problem? I was having the best dream, and you ruined it.
Eaina's delight didn't falter, and she tossed something into Masai's lap. As soon as the object left her hands, her eyes became wilder.
It's here! It's here! It just came this morning, just after dawn! Open it!
Masai glanced down at the object. A long, slender tube with a papyrus exterior lay waiting for him. The symbol of a jackal head was pressed into the middle of the tube with dark, red wax.
Wait a minute.
Masai picked up the tube and then twirled it about, examining it carefully. His mouth fell open, and he just continued to stare at it. His insides quaked. The urge to smile was waiting just behind his mask of astonishment, although it hadn't decided to emerge yet. He must have been sitting there for quite some time because Eaina gave out an annoyed sigh, and she snatched the scroll from him.
Oh, for the love of Dia, give me that!
Masai reached out to take the scroll back, but Eaina wiggled away from him. She laughed loudly and then slipped off one of the ends of the tube. Her nimble fingers slid into the tube while she evaded him, and then she stood up from the bed. She pulled out a scroll and then began to read it aloud.
Masai Iaros, you are hereby summoned to the Temple of Anakanti to undergo the trial of the Acolyte. The ritual will take place at sunset. You will come 2 hours before your trial to the temple to prepare for your journey. Congratulations on being accepted for the rite of the trial. It is advised that you make your final arrangements, should you be unsuccessful. Should you be deemed worthy by Anakanti herself, then I will be proud to call you my brother. Sincerely yours, Cardinal Mahosa Opat.
A deep chill coated his veins, and even his blood felt icy cold. It was finally happening, the very goal that he had been secretly working toward ever since that day. The cold gave way to a sudden, chaotic, spiky sort of anxiety. It burned hot just beneath his skin, and Masai's head swam a little. He was on the verge of reaching his goal, and now that it was a possible reality, he had to confront one unsettling notion. What would his other family members say? Eaina smiled and hugged him tightly. Her mirth and delight bubbled out from her lips, and soon Masai also started laughing. Why was he feeling so much dread? This was a happy moment. This was going to be the new beginning of his life. This was going to be the... A loud voice called out.
What are you girls going on about? Did little Miss Masai finally get his monthly bleeding? Congratulations, you're a real woman now.
Joti stood in the doorway of Masai's room. He was taller than Masai and way more muscular and defined. That made sense, as Joti and Nicholls had followed in their father's footsteps by joining the military. He wore his uniform, which composed of a breastplate made from lacquered rawhide scales, a rawhide skirt, and some sandals. Joti's war axe also hung at his belt. Both of his brothers favored their father in appearance, while Masai and Eaina looked more like their mother. Joti had a thin, well-groomed mustache and goatee, and his brown eyes resonated with the same degree of disappointment they always had. Joti also had a shaved head. Eaina's irises became bathed in fire, and she stormed up to Joti. Compared to their brother, Eaina was shorter by at least a foot, and yet that didn't detract from her fierceness. Joti just watched her, neither smiling nor scowling.
I know over a dozen women who could stamp your balls into paste.
She poked him hard in the chest armor. Her fingers thudded against the scales.
So you had better watch what you say, or I'll tell them.
A small grin grew on his face.
I know more than a dozen myself. I have no problem with women, little sister. What I have a problem with is this little pissant not living up to his destiny. The men in this family have a long-standing tradition, and he threw it away to play page for a bunch of clerics.
Not anymore.
Eaina handed him the scroll.
Soon Masai will be a full cleric, and then he'll have pages himself.
Masai's heart clenched, squeezed, and twisted in his chest. His eyes opened wide, and he tried to reach for the scroll, but Joti held out his hand toward him to keep him back. His other hand twisted the scroll to open it enough for him to read. His eyes scanned the document, and he winced slightly. When Joti regarded Masai again, Masai's spirit shivered.
Anakanti? You never told us you wanted to be a funeral cleric. We thought you were going to follow in your mother's footsteps and join the Order of Baja.
I never told you I was pledging to Baja. In fact, I mentioned I was going to join the Temple of Anakanti last year during the Festival of Choda. None of you ever listened to me.
For a long moment, his older brother just peered into Masai's eyes. Eaina stepped back and held her hands to her chest, a mixture of awkward delight and sudden regret coating her face. Joti licked his lips, but then beamed a wicked, mischievous smile at Masai. Its sudden appearance plunged Masai back into a frigid state.
Does father know?
A moment of silence drifted between them, and then Joti pivoted quickly. He was out of the room before Masai could reach for him. Tension pressed in on the sides of his head, and every breath shook with uncertain aggravation. Joti's voice rang out, and for a moment, he sounded more like a 12-year-old boy rather than a 20-year-old soldier.
Father! Father!
Masai rushed to his nightstand, pulled out some slacks, socks, and grabbed his shoes. As he got dressed, he glared at Eaina.
Why did you do that? How would you have liked it if you were on the receiving end of their torment?
Psh, I'm never on the receiving end.
Eaina's eyes sparkled with impish innocence.
I'm the baby. They're only hard on you because they expect more out of you.
It isn't fair. I can only be the man that I am, not the one they want me to be.
Masai ran down the hallway, and Eaina trailed after him. He entered the main living room, but then stopped once he saw his father. Masai's father sat at the dining room table, and a plate of half-finished breakfast sat before him. He was an impressive man, to say the least. with more than 20 years' experience as a military officer under his belt. A pair of worn but brutally hard eyes sat deep in a wrinkled face. A scar had been carved into his left cheek in his youth, and it had left a dark line just under the eye socket. Masai's father was bald, and he had trimmed black eyebrows. Much like Joti, Masai's father wore his military uniform, although he had several golden cords of rope and sashes to accentuate his higher rank. Masai's father held the scroll of summons in one hand, and his other hand had formed a rage-born fist. Nicholls stood in the doorway of the lavatory, and he looked much like Joti, muscular, dressed in military armor and dark eyes. Nicholls had short black hair, and he also had a sickle sword hanging at his belt. A few more laugh lines were on Nicholls' cheeks. He was the eldest of the Iados siblings, and he usually carried himself with the same level of seriousness that their father did. Eaina stopped beside Masai, and her enjoyment of the situation died instantly. Her eyes opened wide, and she brought her hand to her mouth. Masai's father narrowed his eyes and spoke with acid on his lips.
Explain this now.
Masai stood up straight, held his hands behind his back, and he stared down a little. His voice quivered.
It's a scroll of summons from the Cardinal of Anakanti.
A wolfish snarl appeared on Masai's father's face.
Why are you aligning yourself with the lesser goddess? I tolerated this ridiculous notion because you said you wanted to be a cleric, like your mother.
Joti still grinned a little, obviously proud of his actions. Nicholls just watched Masai with a passive neutrality, but his eyes seemed to laugh at Masai as well.
I am going to be a cleric like Mother.
His father rose from his seat and slammed his fist on the dining table.
Your mother was a cleric of Baja. She worked with steel and metal and weapons and armor. That's respectable. You want to work with corpses. It isn't the same thing.
Masai's fingers shook a little, but he formed his hands into fists. He knew this confrontation was going to come eventually, and perhaps it should have come much sooner. The fear danced in him, and yet Masai tightened his core. He stood up straighter, and he locked eye contact with his father. His words still wavered like a leaf in the wind.
Everyone has to die eventually. So preparing for the journey to R is one of the most important things anyone can ever do. Why are you getting so upset about me wanting to help people make the transition from this life to the next?
His father took a threatening step towards him.
It's beneath us. For generations, the Iados family has served the Pharaoh by giving our blood, sweat, and souls for the army. While we sometimes marry non-military, our family tradition has always remained. You're spitting on everything your ancestors worked for.
A surge of warmth filtered into his throat, and his speech steadied with confidence.
Being a cleric of Anakanti is a worthwhile career, and I'll be able to ensure the people I serve will receive the best care. Someone has to do it.
Rage burned in his father's eyes.
Someone has to clean the muck and shit out of the latrines, but I don't see you rushing for that job. You may not see it, but you're far better than what you're trying to become.
Masai swallowed hard as a brief bubble of silence expanded within the room. This was the moment. This was the real start to the rest of his life. With that in mind, Masai's heart sank for only a second. An unspoken insistence twirled within him, and it pleaded with him.
I'm sorry, Father, but today at sunset, I'm undergoing the trial of the Acolyte. I'll either succeed, or I'll die. Either way, you'll never have to see your failure of a son ever again.
The rage in his father's eyes fell away, and he gaped at Masai with absolute bewilderment. Nicholls' mouth had fallen ajar, and Joti's amusement also disappeared. The air became filled with invisible needles, and they stabbed into Masai at every pore. He didn't care. He had to follow this path. His very soul demanded it. A moment later, Masai's father's eyes became a little more moist, and he snarled at Masai.
Get out. Get out and never come back.
He moved past Masai, and even brushed his shoulder into him, hard. Masai didn't fall over, or even step back, but maintained his position, just like an Iados should. He glanced at Nicholls, then at Joti, and lastly at Eaina. No one said anything. Perhaps none of them could believe what just happened. Or maybe, just maybe, they were stunned by relief at the fact that it finally happened. Masai didn't know, and at this point, he didn't care. He walked to the front door, opened it, and then walked out. When he was free from their gaze, he let the tears flow down his cheeks. He sniffed a little, wiped his face on his sleeve, and then moved into the throng of the crowd. No one paid him any mind. To the everyday citizens of Ignacio, Masai was just another person trying to lead their lives. Most days, Masai found that lack of interest comforting. But today, it only seemed to exacerbate the numb chill of being misunderstood and unappreciated. His sister's voice hooked into his consciousness.
Hold on! Wait up!
Eaina grabbed his shoulder.
Don't go! I can talk to Father. We can work this out. You were both really angry.
Masai whirled around to face her.
I love you, Eaina, but you're as much to blame as Joti and Nicholls. You know how they tease me. Why would you throw Joti the scroll?
She stepped back and gave him weepy eyes.
I'm finished with all of this. Not necessarily with you, and not with them either. I'm finished being seen as the little brother. I'm my own man, and I'm going to be a Cleric of Anakanti. I won't deal with this kind of disrespect anymore.
Once he cools off, Father will let you come back home. He won't care if you're the Cleric of a lesser goddess.
I don't want to come back home. I want an apology. And we both know that won't happen. And another thing. Don't call Anakanti a lesser goddess. She's just as important as the primary five.
Other patrons gave him scorned looks, but Masai didn't care. He started to move down the street again, and Eaina matched his stride.
Why? She isn't one of the 5 divine children of Dia. Dia created Anakanti to serve her and to serve us, much in the same way she created her husband, the holy concubine Dios. Anakanti should feel honored people want to devote themselves to her at all. No one worships Dios.
Masai frowned.
Dios isn't the guardian of the afterlife either. As much emphasis as we put on funeral rites in preparation for our, you would think Anakanti would be more important.
Eaina also frowned, and she tucked her arms against her chest.
Where is all this passion coming from? You've made little adoring comments before, but I've never seen this side of you. It's so zealous.
Do you remember when I was 9 and Joti and Nicholls tricked me into going to the Nefarian Acropolis at night so I could see our mother?
Yeah. You came back the next morning and you were fine. I still can't believe you never told Father about that. They would have gotten in so much trouble.
He shrugged.
I hated how they treated me. But they're my brothers. Even if they are only half ones. I didn't want them to get in trouble. Anyway, the only reason I was fine was because one of the clerics of Anakanti stayed with me and protected me. Had she not taken the time to care for me, I would have died.
You're being dramatic.
Masai shook his head.
As soon as the sun set, a pack of hungry Necropolis guardians surrounded me. They were the size of horses, and there must have been a dozen of them. She saved me from getting eaten.
She stared at him for a few seconds before her eyes widened. She batted him in the arm with a hand.
You never told me that, you jerk! What else have you been keeping from me?
I never told you, because you were 7 and more interested in collecting flowers and playing with butterflies. Besides, I was scared out of my wits.
Ooh, what did they look like? What did they smell like? Did they chase you down before she saved you?
For the moment, the unsettling stress of the morning faded into the backdrop, and she practically skipped beside him. An unexpected smile slithered on her face, and she beamed at Masai with anticipation.
I've heard stories, but I've never met someone who's actually seen them in real life.
They looked like jackals, only they were the size of horses. As a kid, they towered over me. Their breath smelled hot and musty, like they'd eaten rotten flesh. It was very traumatic.
So because a cleric was nice to you 9 years ago, you want to devote your life to playing with dead people.
It's a sacred duty.
Masai stopped at the corner of the block and looked all around. Dozens of people moved about, going past them, each of them looking unique and individual in their own ways.
Every single person has to make the journey to stand before Anakanti. Everyone's going to be judged, and they know it. They don't like to talk about it, but it's at the back of their minds. Clerics of Anakanti ensure the bodies are prepared properly, the right spells are cast on the bodies and on the tombs, and the people make successful transitions between worlds. However, if people live evil lives, then their bodies turn gray, and they're doomed to eternal torment.
And you don't care that society will treat you like a pariah. You don't mind that people will automatically assume that you conspire with them.
Although Masai and Eaina received annoyed looks for stopping in the middle of the street, no one appeared to be listening to what they were saying.
The Zur are nothing more than Anakanti radicals, and they're so deep in the shadows of Enonochian culture, it won't really matter.
He started to walk with the flow of the crowd again. Eaina walked beside him.
No one we know has actually seen or met one of the Zur. The fact that everyone assumes all Anakanti clerics are part of the Zur makes the Order itself so much less important in the eyes of the people. I'm going to go check in at the Academy. Want to come?
Eaina's cheeks turned slightly more crimson, and she darted her attention to the people around them.
I've got things to do before I start my day. I know you're going to pass your trial, and we can have dinner to celebrate when you become a full cleric. Your treat.
As she walked away, Masai called after her.
So when are you going to tell the family you're an Acolyte too?
Eaina stopped in her tracks, marched back up to him, and placed her hand over Masai's mouth.
Shh! Do you want to get Father mad at me too? Why do you think I'm not going with you to the Academy? If Father comes looking for you, I don't want him to put 2 and 2 together.
You still have some time before you get your scroll of summoning. Have you approached any of the temple representatives yet?
I was thinking Sarah because she deals with medicine and poison, but I'm not sure yet.
Masai let out a hearty laugh, which rightfully earned a hard stare from Eaina.
What's so damn funny?
Father is horribly upset at me for choosing Anakanti. But just imagine how furious he's going to be when he finds out that you're thinking about joining the Temple of the Snake.
Masai wrapped his arm around Eaina's neck and pulled her in for a hug.
Still, it'll be nice to have a healer in the family.
Eaina elbowed him in the chest, hard.
You'd better keep your mouth shut. I'll tell Father when I'm good and ready.
What about Joti and Nicholls? You know how those two are.
I know if they give me any problems, I'll kick them in the balls so hard, they'll probably have to visit you for funeral rites.
Who knows? Maybe you'll devote yourself to Anakanti too.
She rolled her eyes.
Whatever. The next time I see you, you had better be a full cleric.
Eaina melted into the constant flow of the crowd, and in turn, Masai drifted along, but in the other direction. Rather than go straight to the academy, he just wandered aimlessly. His thoughts jumbled all over the place, going from one lump of stress to the next. His family did not support him. He would be a pariah. He was going to have to pass the trial. The general people didn't appreciate Anakanti, the goddess of death. All of it was just so heavy. Eventually, Masai found himself at the entrance to the lively Ijikos Bazaar. A large painted signpost hung above the street that read, All merchants reserve the right to stab thieves to death. Long live free trade. Long live the market. Masai grinned as he moved into the bazaar. While the message seemed a bit overly dramatic at first, before the rule was set in place, there was a lot of rampant theft. An abundance of smells wrapped around Masai's face like fine silk scarves. Numerous wooden display tables and desks lined the streets, and each of the stands had thick brown tarps over them to provide the poor merchants with some shade. The more affluent merchants actually had buildings from which they sold their wares, while the less fortunate ones had to use the city-provided wooden stalls. Masai's stomach growled loudly. He approached one of the bakeries and felt his side for his coin pouch. A sudden cold spasm flickered within him, and then he sighed. His stomach growled again, this time with more fury. He turned away from the bakery. A familiar voice beckoned him, so Masai turned back around. A wide-framed man with a thick chocolate-colored beard stepped out of the bakery. He had a fresh-baked loaf of bread in his pudgy grasp. The man wore tan robes, and his chest had flour caked on the fabric. He actually lived in Masai's neighborhood, perhaps several blocks away. The baker smiled.
Hey, I heard you received a scroll of summons today. Congratulations.
Masai tilted his head slightly.
How did you hear about it? Who told you?
Are you kidding me?
The baker let out a brief chuckle.
The only kinds of people who usually come out of our neighborhood are soldiers and blacksmiths. It's not every day we see a scroll left on someone's doorstep. We need more clerics, that's for sure. Here.
The baker handed Masai the loaf of bread.
It's on the house.
Thank you.
The warmth from the bread and its enticing smell made his mouth water.
So, which of the 5 are you going for?
And just like that, Masai's joy evaporated.
Actually, I'm taking the trial of the Acolyte for the Temple of Anakanti.
The baker's glee disappeared just as rapidly.
You're going to handle dead bodies?
Masai nodded.
Everyone needs funeral services, right?
The baker let out an obviously awkward giggle before he backstepped toward the entrance of his shop. His eyes grew distant, and the smile slowly descended until it became an ever so slight frown.
Yeah, I suppose they do. Well, have a nice day.
Without glancing back, the baker whirled around and rushed inside. Other patrons and street vendors gaped at Masai with disgusted expressions, and they started to back away from him as well. Some people averted their eyes as if he were a leper, and others openly glared at him as if he were an affront to the sanctity of life. Masai winced, but he bit into the bread anyway. Damn these people for not understanding how vital and wonderful the goddess Anakanti was. Each of them would stand before her one day, and they would be forced to explain why they had treated her name and legacy so poorly. The bread tasted wonderful, and yet Masai's stomach still churned with sour acid. Eaina's words echoed in his mind. Masai started moving through the crowd again, and those who had heard his declaration gave him a wide berth. Swift bitterness gripped him, so even mentioning a favorable opinion toward the Order of Anakanti made him a pariah? Would these people be so hostile to the great jackal goddess when they needed help preparing their bodies for the journey to Ar? Everyone needed the clerics of Anakanti eventually. Being around these people made Masai's gut radiate with tension, and so he made his way to the Acolyte Academy. As soon as he entered the building, his heart lightened and his breaths came with less effort. Whereas the other acolytes had the penchant for being just as judgmental as the closed-minded masses, there were at least some sympathetic individuals who could understand the basis for Masai's choice. Like him, they were called toward a certain deity. Masai moved through the corridors with a sense of urgency. Slowly but surely, the gravity of his impending ritual pressed down upon him. Within several hours, Masai would take the first steps into a much larger world. The Acolyte Academy was a large multi-floored building with dozens of classrooms, libraries, and storerooms. Each of the storerooms held valuable resources that aided in the instruction and integration of acolytes. Despite the grand function of the building, its design was quite austere. None of the walls had any adornments, and the floors were wooden and unpainted. None of the orders were allowed to have any representation within the confines of the academy. It was through extensive learning that acolytes were led to their prospective patron deities. Masai passed by several classrooms, where younger acolytes listened to lectures from more experienced clerics. The clerics themselves were dressed in white robes, and they were not permitted to wear any of their regalia. Of course, each of the instructors talked up their own orders. Of the 50 or so instructors, there were only 3 Anakanti cleric instructors. Likewise, there were only 3 classes about the Order of Anakanti, one of which was required to be taken by every acolyte. Once upon a time, Masai had been one of those young and impressionable acolytes. Unlike most acolytes, however, Masai had his path selected long before his acceptance into the academy. Many of the other acolytes in his cohort had learned of his apparent interest when Masai decided to take the other 2 classes dedicated to Anakanti. Most of them distanced themselves away from him, but a few kept friendly relations. One of the older acolytes within one of the classrooms noticed him. Judging from the way everyone stood around, the class had not begun yet. The other acolyte was a young man of well-fed proportions. He had short, sandy brown hair, a pair of bushy eyebrows, and a wide and charming smile. The young man had to have easily weighed 300 pounds, but he carried it well for someone shorter than Masai.
Hey, Masai! Wait up!
Masai turned around and waited for Rykos to move up to him. Rykos' smile grew wider.
Hey, I heard the good news! Congratulations! Who are you pledging to?
Masai winced.
I'm pledging myself to Anakanti.
It takes a special kind of person to willingly dedicate themselves to the Jackal. Then again, you always favored her lore above all others. I knew you would pledge to that order.
He slapped Masai in the shoulder lightly.
I'm confident that you'll be one of the best embalmers that Ijakos has seen in a long time.
Masai smiled.
At least someone has confidence in me. My family hated the idea of me becoming a funeral cleric.
I'm sorry to hear that, but can you blame them? The Order of Anakanti doesn't exactly have the best reputation.
Rykos crossed his arms over his broad chest.
The emergence of the Zur and the whole playing with dead bodies shtick makes people nervous and unsettled. Most people would cringe at that career path, but not you.
It's a sacred duty to help people on their path toward R.
You don't have to convince me. I respect you for stepping up.
I'm certain that you'll get your summoning scroll soon, too. Have you decided who you're going to pledge to?
Rykos flexed his arms.
Sotar of the River. The first thing I'm gonna do when I become cleric is take my father's fishing boat all the way down the Vibian wildlands and sail it back up. That'll show everyone how tough I am.
Masai turned to leave.
The crocodile will suit you. I hope the jackal suits me.
Don't you worry about that. The jackal does. As long as I've known you, you've always maintained the solemn attitude most Anakanti clerics have.
He started to move back to the classroom entrance.
Good luck on your ritual. I know you're gonna be a successful cleric one day.
Masai let out a heavy sigh as he continued down the corridor. He climbed to the set of stairs that led to the second floor, and he walked into the requisition room. Within the room, a young woman named Kei-Shaedo sat behind a small oak desk. Her single braid of black hair fell to her right side, and her brown eyes bore holes into a scroll that rested in front of her. She smiled, blinked, and then actually noticed Masai. When she did, she jumped back in fright.
Oh, by Dia's holy might. You scared me. I hear you got your scroll. Are you excited?
Masai bit the insides of his lip.
You heard about it too? How does everyone know about that?
Well, we figured you'd be getting it any day now.
The woman rested her hands in her lap.
You really impressed that creepy old Anakanti instructor with your answers. She left the academy with such haste yesterday that everyone knew that you'd be getting summoned soon. So you're finally ready to get out of here, huh?
Yeah, one way or another.
He pointed to the back room.
I need a fresh set of garments for my trial. Can I please have a large shirt and a comfortable pair of slacks?
Kei-Shaedo gave him a prolonged smile and locked gazes with him.
Sure thing.
She fluttered her eyes for a moment before she disappeared into the back room where all the supplies were stored. Kei-Shaedo was beautiful, to be sure. In fact, she was the most desired of all the initiates, and both men and women sought to spend time with her. Even Rykos entertained the ideas of winning Kei-Shaedo's heart. For Masai, it was a little different, though. While Kei-Shaedo had a kind of primal and vibrant radiance, she wasn't the nameless Anakanti cleric. There wasn't any sense of attraction for Masai, so he kept his distance. Who would have thought that that act of defiance would have captured Kei-Shaedo's interests? Several moments later, Kei-Shaedo returned with a small stack of clothes. As she handed him the clothes, she leaned in closely.
You're going to follow Anakanti, aren't you?
Her eyes grew a little wider, and she smiled all the more.
Yes I am. I suppose I was fairly obvious with my devotion to her.
Kei-Shaedo nodded.
In class, you were always one of the only students who knew stuff about her lore, faith, and rites.
She paused and studied him for a second.
I've heard the trial of the Acolyte for Anakanti is the most dangerous of them all. You're so brave.
Masai shrugged a little.
I'm not that brave. Besides, I've been mentally preparing for what's to come ever since I first realized who I was going to pledge to. Do you know who you'll pledge to?
I'm a forest girl. So naturally, I'm going with Chota the baboon.
She leaned in quickly and pressed her lips to Masai's cheek. 1,000 volts of lightning zapped through his nerve endings, and he eased back away from her. His cheeks ignited with an Arcos-worthy flame. Kei-Shaedo laughed and grinned smugly at him.
Good luck. If you survive, come visit me sometime. I would love to celebrate with you.
Masai's words died before they could even be formed, and so he just nodded. He backstepped out of the requisition office, and never once did his eyes break from Kei-Shaedo's. Her stance was one of victory, as if she had just won a battle, or if she had cornered a prey. As soon as he left the requisition room, he moved with haste. There was still a lot to do before his trial began. The sun plummeted toward the horizon, and like the end of the day, Masai's life as he knew it was drawing to a close. His soul stretched between two powerful forces, and his excitement and anxiety tugged at his core with unrelenting determination. At any point, Masai's spirit could shatter into 1,000,000 shards. Did his brothers feel this way before their military exams? Did his father have this surge of wild kinetic energy before a battle? Too bad Masai would never be able to ask them. Masai pushed his family from his thoughts as he moved down the streets of Ignacio with nervous steps. The sky was on the verge of sunset, and many people were scrambling to get home. Many people whom Masai passed glanced at him with awe-inspired expressions. At the moment, Masai wore a bright white outfit, and it signified his devotion to the gods and goddesses. No doubt each of the men and women wondered which of the primary 5 Masai would serve. Would they have gaped at him with such eagerness? if they knew he intended on adorning the black robes? Masai moved with haste, although it wasn't out of any anxiousness of being late. His guts became 10 times heavier as soon as he came within sight of the great temple of Anakanti, and they vibrated with righteous passion as soon as he entered the temple. He had never been outside of the Ignacio area, but it was to Masai's understanding that the Anakanti temples across Enonoch looked identical. One day, he would take a trip throughout the whole kingdom and visit them all. The Temple of Anakanti had numerous exterior columns carved from onyx, and each one of them were covered in etched glyphs. Plain colored tiles covered the roof of the temple, but beautiful reliefs adorned the exterior temple walls. Most of the citizens of Ignacio never really stopped and appreciated the art corresponding to the jackal, but Masai absolutely loved them. Some of the artwork depicted the journey of the afterlife and the eminent judging of Lady Death. In many of the reliefs, a gigantic jackal-headed woman sat poised on a throne made from human bones and skulls. She usually stared down at the individuals being judged, and she always carried a staff with a golden ankh headpiece. According to Masai's lesson, the staff was a divine artifact known as the Great Ankh. The Temple of Anakanti sat elevated 20 feet above the ground, and it rested on a great stone block. A wide stone staircase rose from the ground to the set of ornate metal double doors. Images of great jackals were etched into the doors. Dozens of Anakanti clerics rushed up and down the temple steps, and most didn't even give Masai a passing glance. They were dressed in fine black robes and carried staves with unique-looking headpieces on them. One of the clerics had a skull headpiece, while several others had jackal headpieces. Masai entered the temple and waved down one of the clerics.
Excuse me, I'm taking the trial of the Acolyte at sunset. Can you please tell me where to go?
The cleric paused for a moment and gave Masai a weighing glance. After a brief moment, he pointed toward the interior of the temple, toward a corridor.
Go to the chamber with the urn glyph above the door. Someone will be waiting for you. Good luck.
Black marble floors spanned the temple's interior, and marvelous white mosaics covered the walls. Just like the outside, the interior depicted dead souls making their way through the land of the dead. The ceiling hung 30 feet above Masai. A wide staircase led to the second floor. Masai clutched the stack of clothes to his chest as he walked down the corridor. His insides tugged in various directions. The very atmosphere of the temple pressed down upon him, and his panic elevated. He just had to succeed. He scanned the doorways in search of the urn glyph. The room Masai sought was at the very back of the temple. A single torch flickered within the room, and a pair of young boys with shaved heads waited inside. When he walked into the room, one of the boys stood up.
Are you Masai Iaros?
He nodded. The other boy stood up.
Good luck on your upcoming trial. Please get undressed and prepare to be purified.
Without waiting for Masai to respond, the boy grabbed the stack of clothes from Masai and set them aside. The boys averted their eyes while Masai got undressed. Once he had fully disrobed, the boys grabbed small urns that had been sitting off to the side.
Kneel and close your eyes, or this will sting.
Masai knelt before the temple pages and closed his eyes. Seconds passed by, and he controlled his breathing, even though his stomach threatened to erupt violently. A warm, thick liquid poured over his shoulders and body. While the air in the temple was saturated with desert heat, the temperature nestled within the liquid soothed Masai. His nerves stilled, and his tension eased away. Another stream poured over his head, an intoxicating mixture of floral aromas and familiar earthy scents cascaded all around him. The very essence of the desert covered him. The streams stopped, and a pair of thick cloths started smearing the liquid in. His pores came alive, and his muscles purred with great relaxation. Time ceased to have any meaning as the boys worked away all the liquid with their towels.
We're done.
Groggily, Masai opened his eyes. The boys turned to leave. When they got to the door, they turned around and grinned at Masai. One of the boys gave him a slight bow.
May you be found worthy in your trial.
The other boy said nothing but led his friend away. Masai's skin tingled with a sense of freshness. His old clothes had disappeared, and so he got dressed in the attire he had brought with him. Masai had just pulled on his shirt when a tall cleric strolled into the room. She spoke with a gravelly voice.
You will follow me to the Chamber of Reflection. While there, you'll consider why you deserve to join our order. Hold on to that truth, for you will have to present it to Anakanti herself. Do you have any questions?
Masai shook his head, and so the cleric led him through the temple. During their small excursion, she didn't speak to him, nor did she even acknowledge him. In fact, none of the other clerics in the temple paid him any mind either. The cleric led him to a chamber on the other side of the temple, close to the front entrance. A glyph of a great open third eye rested above the chamber door, and it watched Masai as he approached. Shivers slithered down his spine. A single torch burned in the center of the room. Dozens of shadows gyrated on the walls, as if they were engaged in some kind of fantastic umbral orgy. Many of the shadows extended from other acolytes, and yet other shadows didn't have visible sources. Each of the acolytes sat on large pillows, and they faced the walls with their hands at their sides and their eyes closed. The sounds of flickering flames and the collective breathings were the only melodies that drifted on the air. A dense sense of pressure greeted Masai as he stepped fully into the chamber. His own sense of anxiety fed into the already present potent ocean. The cleric led Masai to an empty pillow and pointed at it. She didn't glance at him, but instead she peered into the darkness. Masai's head swam a little, and it spun frantically as he sat upon the pillow. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, the spinning got worse. However, after he took a deep breath, the dizziness went away. Many thoughts rushed his mind at once. A harmony of perfectly in-tuned doubts and fears assaulted his psyche. A sudden strain threatened to overtake him, but Masai kept breathing deeply and exhaling. When he drew in breath, Masai imagined his internal organs and muscles relaxing. When he exhaled, he visualized his body pushing out little spheres of frustration or stress into the world past his lips. Masai synchronized his breathing with that of the other acolytes. The noises faded into the background of the universe, and Masai floated amidst solitude and contemplation. Questions echoed in his mind.
Who am I? Why am I here? What am I trying to do? What will I do in the future? Will my family ever accept me? For me? Do I even care if they do? Will I ever see her face again?
Someone tapped Masai on the shoulder, and Masai's mind froze. None of the questions resonated any longer, and a great and empty blackness spread within him. Aside from the flickering torch flames, the rest of the room was silent. Masai opened his eyes, and only he and the cleric who had led him here before were within the chamber. She didn't utter a word, but gestured for Masai to follow her. Masai hopped to his feet, and his legs tingled, as if they were infested with 1,000 ants. His movements were a little jerky at first, but his lower limbs woke up. The temple was dark, which meant the sun had long disappeared from the sky. Dozens of torches and lanterns hung on the walls, and so the corridors were bathed in alluring firelight. The cleric led Masai to a downward stairwell, down the stairs, and into an even more poorly lit set of corridors. She traipsed down a right corridor with several rooms lining it on either side. Acolytes kneeled in the rooms, but they didn't move or say anything. They just stared off into nothingness. Although Masai knew better. Soon, he would be on his knees too. In one of the chambers, several clerics stood over the prone body of a female acolyte. Even in the poor light, Masai noticed the acolyte's gray flesh.
She failed the trial. She'll never get to R now.
The cleric led Masai to an empty chamber and pointed to the center of the floor. A small, thick, circular rug covered the central area. Towards the far wall, a small cot and an even smaller table stood against the wall. A small bronze rod covered in carved glyphs and a small bottle with a cork in the top sat on the table. Masai stood in the center of the room while the cleric went for the items. She uncorked the bottle and gave it a little whiff.
You will drink this when I tell you to. This potion is created from the pressed juices of the blue ambamba flower. Be warned, it tastes quite foul.
Masai took it from her.
Will this potion allow me to take my journey?
Yes, it'll allow your body to separate from your soul.
She handed him the rod.
You'll hold this while you drink the juice. Its function will be obvious soon. Do you have any last-minute questions?
Masai shook his head.
In that case, get on your knees and drink the juice. I'll wait for you to finish your journey. One way or another.
Masai got to his knees and brought the bottle to his lips. A sweet taste touched his tongue, and the juices coated his throat and mouth like honey. It reminded him of delicious berries. Instantly, the sweetness faded, and a violent wave of disgusting distinction assaulted his taste buds. Though Masai had never consumed rotten corpses before, Masai imagined the flavor was a lot better than this potion. Masai had to force himself not to vomit, and he consumed the entire bottle.
It'll take some time for the juice to really hit your system. But when it does, beware.
Strange sensations slowly crept on Masai's consciousness. His throat swelled up and his pupils dilated to the largest possible size. The cleric said something, but her words came out in a dark, deep, slow tone. As Masai watched her, the cleric's face distorted. Her eyes stretched wider and melted into vertical pools. Her extended arms stretched out further and her mouth spread over half of her face, both in height and width. Giant teeth jutted from her gigantic mouth, and they began to glow with unnatural whiteness. Crude little voices called out his name, and from the corner of his eyes, Masai saw the shadows take shape. They took human forms, and they danced wildly. They had no visible eyes, but Masai knew they watched him. The ground grew flowers, and once the little flowers bloomed, little human heads emerged from the centers. Each one of the flower faces had either Joti's or Nicholls' face, and they teased him and called him names. Blood-red rage festered in Masai's veins, and he considered reaching out to start ripping up the flowers. But his body refused to move. His head tilted back on its own accord, and suddenly, Masai watched his body from above. A pair of black, soulless eyes stared back at him. The cleric stood over him, but she melted into a large, gooey puddle. The flowers bent over and started eating up parts of the glue with their mouths. Everything faded in a blanket of brilliant, bright, white light.